You're not imagining it. The world really just watched America's closest allies, Europe, Canada, and Australia, sanction a sitting U.S. president and the entities tied to his inner circle. This is not normal. For decades, Washington has been the one writing the sanctions lists, punishing dictators, corrupt oligarchs, and rogue regimes. Tonight, the tables have turned. We've spent an entire year covering this presidency in all its glory, from the lawsuits and the threats to sweeping bombshells under the rug or pardoning inner circle allies. But tonight, we are in a true nightmare year, where our historic allies have decided they can no longer trust the United States. Brussels, London, Ottawa, and Canberra have issued coordinated announcements. They aren't just sending a symbolic message. They have frozen assets and banned travel. They are treating the Commander-in-Chief of the United States like a man running a rogue state. The big question we must decode tonight is, what story finally snapped their patience? Many don't recognize the sheer gravity of this fracture. This isn't just a personal Trump drama. It's the collapse of the Western alliance.
Well, I think we can have a little bit of fun with this, and we'll probably do a few episodes like this as the year comes to an end, because to be candid, people sit there in shock most of the time, but I think people also don't recognize, Sean, how many failures there really are of the Trump administration. So this isn't necessarily my top number one, but this retribution campaign of his has completely fallen flat on its face, right? I mean, he tried to go after James Comey. That failed because he installed someone who was an illegal U.S. attorney. The indictment that she signed turned out to be missing two plus hours of a transcript. It looks like they're not going to be able to prosecute James Comey. And then Letitia James is even more of an embarrassment. Letitia James, the attorney general from the state of New York, who prosecuted Trump, who he clearly was going after for this mortgage fraud, where there was no mortgage fraud. She disclosed to the lender. And then they tried, after that indictment got thrown out, they tried to get the grand jury to indict her, not once, not twice, but I guess you could say 3 times.
Yeah.
And that was a complete failure. I don't think any of his retribution prosecutions against his so-called enemies have gone anywhere. So that's my first one, Sean.
Well, our allies waited patiently for Congress, the courts, and the American voters to self-correct, but they've concluded that the guardrails are no longer working. When a superpower transitions into a personalized regime, and when White House decisions start looking more like private business deals than public office, the outside world stops pretending everything is normal. We are watching a vote of no confidence in America's leadership. Allies restricting intelligence sharing with Washington within the Five Eyes framework isn't just a snub. It's a survival move to protect themselves from an unreliable center. From its position as the architect of the global sanctions system, the U.S. has now become the target of those very same tools. Markets are reeling, the S&P is down, and gold is surging as investors reprice the institutional risk of the United States. The real question is no longer whether Trump survives this, but whether the very idea of America as the anchor of the democratic world can survive this presidency. The history of American power in the post-World War II era has been defined by its role as the chief architect of the global sanctions system. From Iran to Russia and Venezuela to North Korea, Washington has wielded the U.S. dollar and access to its financial markets as a weapon to punish rogue regimes and corrupt oligarchs. But in this nightmare year of 2025, we are witnessing an unprecedented and symbolic reversal. The architect of the system has become its own target. When democratic allies like the EU, the United Kingdom, Canada, and Australia decide to sanction a sitting U.S. president and the businesses around him, they are not just punishing a person. They are sending a verdict on what America has become. This shift is the result of a documented pattern of kleptocracy, where money, power, and impunity concentrate at the top. Allies have watched as allegations of foreign payments and suspected personal interests, documented in the Desert Files, began to blur the line between public policy and private business deals.
Model for literally and figuratively for the kind of women that he wants to surround himself with. But from there, I'd pivot to another one where he's failed with respect to now this time removing somebody. He's tried to remove the chair of the Fed, Jerome Powell. That's completely failed. He hasn't got anywhere with that. But remember, and people forget this, he tried to remove Lisa Cook, who's the first female African-American appointed to the Fed. She's a governor. It's a very high ranking position. He tried to fire her again on this sort of garbage mortgage fraud claim. And somebody listening to this might go, well, it's not garbage. No, it's pretty much garbage. She disclosed that this wasn't her primary residence. That not only did that fail, but then the Supreme Court refused to remove her and has set that case for oral argument. And even in a recent hearing, they distinguished between him firing other people who were appointed by the president to the specificity of a Fed governor. So that one.
For partners in Brussels and London, the American presidency has started to look less like a pillar of the free world and more like the very models of power they once sanctioned alongside Washington. This isn't just about one man, it is about what happens when a presidency starts to look like a private revenue stream. The danger of a sanctioned presidency is that it rewrites the rules of international leadership, fundamentally changing who leads, who follows, and who gets to set the rules of the global order. Allies do not sanction their closest partner over a simple policy disagreement or a bad phone call. They do it because they have stopped believing that U.S. domestic institutions, the Congress and the courts, can effectively restrain their own leader. By treating the U.S. commander-in-chief like the leader of a rogue state, freezing his assets and banning his travel, these nations are acting to protect their own financial systems and democratic integrity. If the United States will not police its own leadership, the rest of the democratic world has concluded they must do it themselves to survive. The current crisis has forced America's closest partners to confront a terrifying reality. The institutional guardrails of the United States are failing. For decades, the Western alliance was built on the shared belief that American democracy possessed internal mechanisms, Congress, the judiciary, and a free press, capable of restraining any executive overreach. However, the events of this nightmare year have shattered that confidence. Global leaders in London, Brussels, and Ottawa are no longer watching a political drama. They are witnessing a systemic stress test that the U.S. is failing. The paralysis of U.S. institutions is visible in the repeated legal meltdowns and the inability to maintain a standard of public office. When allies observe a presidency deeply entangled with money and allegations of corruption, they look to the American courts and Congress for a remedy. But when those domestic institutions move too slowly or appear gridlocked by polarization, the international community concludes that the guardrails aren't working. They see a presidency that has begun to look like a private business deal, where power is wielded for impunity rather than the public good. This loss of faith is not merely a symbolic snub, it is a strategic calculation. Allies have concluded that if America will not police its own leader, they must take unilateral action to protect their own interests.
When it comes to his own personal lawsuits, Sean. And just a couple that come to mind is he's had court of appeal for the Seventh Circuit, that's out of basically the Illinois area, dismiss, I believe, at least two of his lawsuits in the last 30 days. One was against CNN, and another massive lawsuit that kind of flew below my radar screen, but he had sued Hillary Clinton, the Democratic National Committee, and a bunch of other people over the claims about the election and the election fraud and issues like that. I believe that one of those lawsuits, my best friend Lindsay Halligan represented him in, and she and Trump both got sanctioned almost $1 million for basically
the decision to treat the sitting president of the United States as a target for sanctions is a verdict on the state of American democracy itself. It reflects a belief that the presidency has drifted into a model of kleptocracy, a system where power is used to protect personal interests at the expense of allied trust and constitutional norms. By breaking ranks, Canada, Europe, and Australia are signaling that the United States can no longer be trusted as the reliable anchor of the free world. They are moving from a position of dependence on Washington to one of self-protection from it. This institutional paralysis has created a vacuum where allies feel they must redraw the global map without the certainty of American leadership, as the risk of executive overreach in Washington has become too great to ignore. The most damaging fracture of this nightmare year is not found in a public speech or a trade tariff, but in the quiet, shadowed corridors of global intelligence sharing. The Five Eyes Alliance, the world's most elite intelligence sharing network, comprising the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, is facing a systemic rupture that threatens the very bedrock of Western security. For decades, The seamless flow of information between these nations was founded on absolute trust. Today, in the wake of this sanctioned presidency, that trust has effectively evaporated. Allies have become increasingly terrified that sensitive intelligence passed to Washington might fall into the hands of adversaries, particularly Russia, through the presidency itself. This fear is not a partisan theory. It is a calculated strategic assessment by foreign intelligence agencies who have watched as classified information allegedly goes astray.
That the Attorney General of the state of California, a fellow by the name of Rob Bonta, has filed or joined 52 lawsuits against the Trump administration. And those where decisions have been made, some are still pending, that the state of California has won the vast majority of them. But I think we should talk about this in another episode, Sean, is the sort of what has started out as the immigration attack and what's happened to it. So let's put that all on hold for a second. But a number of these lawsuits have fallen completely flat, or they've overturned policies that the Trump administration has tried.
In response, we are witnessing something once unthinkable. London, Ottawa, and Canberra are quietly restricting and holding back intelligence from the United States. This intelligence cutoff is a desperate attempt to prevent their own national secrets from being compromised by an executive office they no longer perceive as a safe repository. When allies start holding back intelligence from Washington, it is not merely a symbolic snub or a political tantrum, it is a survival move. These nations have concluded that the risk of sharing is now greater than the risk of isolation. This fracture in the Five Eyes represents a definitive cut line in the global order, where the lifeblood of modern security is being strangled by a lack of trust in the American executive. By limiting the data flow, our closest partners are erecting digital and diplomatic barriers to insulate themselves from what they now categorize as an unreliable and compromised center in Washington. This breakdown of the intelligence sharing mechanism is perhaps the clearest indicator of America's transition from the leader of the free world to a global risk factor. If our closest partners feel they must protect themselves from the very country they once relied on for protection, the foundation of the Democratic Alliance has essentially collapsed. The real danger is not just that America is perceived as weak, but that a presidency entangled in conflict and suspicion can make the entire Western alliance system look unreliable and vulnerable to the very regimes it was built to contain. Financial markets are rarely emotional, but they are incredibly sensitive to institutional risk. In this nightmare year of 2025, the global financial system is delivering a cold, hard verdict on the stability of the United States. For decades, the U.S. dollar served as the undisputed anchor of global trade, not just because of America's economic size, but because of the trust in its legal system and the predictability of its policies. That trust is now evaporating. As allies move to sanction the American executive, investors are forced to do something once considered unthinkable. They are repricing the sovereign risk of the United States of America. The reaction has been swift and brutal. We are seeing a historic surge in the price of gold, the ultimate anti-dollar asset, as central banks from London to Tokyo quietly shift their reserves away from U.S. treasuries. This isn't just a market fluctuation, it is a strategic retreat. When the architect of the global financial system is perceived as a rogue actor by its own allies, the currency of that architect loses its status as a safe haven. The S&P 500 is reeling not because of a standard recession, but because the very foundations of international trade, treaties, alliances, and the rule of law are being shredded by executive overreach and chaotic tariff policies. The tariff chaos mentioned in the legal filings is perhaps the most visible catalyst for this meltdown. By attempting to bypass Congress and impose massive taxes under the guise of national security, the presidency has turned trade into a battlefield where even friends are treated as enemies. Major American corporations like Costco and other retail giants are now suing their own government, claiming these tariffs are unconstitutional power grabs that bypass the legislative branch's sole authority to tax. To the rest of the world, this looks like a country in the midst of a constitutional breakdown, where the executive branch no longer respects the limits of its own power. This economic revolt is the financial equivalent of the Five Eyes intelligence fracture. It is a de-dollarization born out of necessity rather than ideology. Allies are looking for an exit strategy because they can no longer afford to be tethered to a center that uses the global financial system as a tool for personal retribution or erratic policy shifts. As the nightmare year progresses, the verdict from the markets is clear. America's greatest economic asset, its reputation for stability, is being liquidated in real time. If the US dollar ceases to be the world's reserve currency, the true hidden cost of this presidency will be felt by every American taxpayer for generations to come. The most visible symbol of Western security for over 75 years has been NATO, an organization built on the bedrock principle of collective defense. An attack on one is an attack on all. But in this nightmare year of 2025, that bedrock is crumbling into dust. As America's historic allies, the very nations that form the core of NATO, move to sanction the American executive, the North Atlantic Treaty is transitioning from a vibrant shield of democracy into what strategic analysts are calling a hollow alliance. You cannot have a mutual defense pact where the lead member is viewed as a systemic threat by the other signatories. The legal and strategic paradox of Article 5 has now reached a breaking point. Article 5 is not just a sentence in a treaty, it is a promise of absolute trust. But how can Paris, Berlin, or London pledge the lives of their soldiers to defend a center in Washington that they have formally designated as compromised and corrupt? The sanctions issued by European powers are a clear signal that they no longer view the American presidency as the guardian of the alliance, but as an erratic force that requires containment. We are witnessing the strategic decoupling of Europe from the United States, a process that has accelerated from a slow drift into a panicked flight toward self-reliance. This fracture is leading to the rise of an independent European defense architecture, a move that Washington has fought to prevent for decades. By treating the U.S. executive as a rogue actor, the European Union is effectively declaring that the American umbrella is no longer reliable. They are moving to build their own command structures and intelligence hubs that intentionally bypass U.S. involvement. To the rest of the world, NATO now looks like a house with a magnificent facade but a rotted foundation. The institutional memory of cooperation is being replaced by a culture of suspicion, where every joint exercise and every shared secret is viewed through the lens of potential betrayal by a sanctioned leader. This is the ultimate cost of a presidency that prioritizes personal grievances over allied stability. When the leader of the free world is no longer invited to the inner room where the real decisions are made, the alliance is over in all but name. As we look at the wreckage of 2025, it is clear that the nightmare isn't just a domestic legal meltdown in American courts, it is the permanent loss of the greatest force multiplier in human history. A NATO without American credibility is merely a paper tiger, and a world without a functional NATO is a significantly more dangerous place for every citizen of the West. The retribution campaign of the 2025 nightmare year is far more than a string of domestic legal failures. It has become a slow-acting poison paralyzing American diplomacy on the global stage. When a nation that once branded itself as the city upon a hill and the ultimate arbiter of justice begins to weaponize its judicial system against political rivals, the world doesn't just watch with concern, it watches with profound contempt. The coordinated sanctions from historic allies against the American executive serve as the final crushing verdict on Washington's attempt to transform the rule of law into a tool for personal vengeance. Take a hard look at the collapse of the prosecutions against James Comey and Letitia James. These were not mere procedural stumbles. They were public exposures of a system attempting to bend reality, only to be snapped back by constitutional guardrails. The installation of illegal prosecutors and the filing of indictments missing hours of critical exculpatory evidence turned American courtrooms into theaters of the absurd. For diplomats in London, Paris, or Tokyo, the question is no longer what is America doing, but rather, how can we sign a treaty with an administration that cannot even follow its own laws? This diplomatic paralysis is most evident when the U.S. State Department attempts to lecture the world on the rule of law or anti-corruption at international summits. Those calls now fall on deaf ears, often met with quiet smirks from partners who used to take Washington's word as gospel. When a sitting president and his inner circle are sanctioned for behaviors that allies categorize as institutional kleptocracy, the moral authority to lead the free world effectively vanishes. U.S. diplomats are now operating in a vacuum of credibility, isolated not by a lack of military might, but by the total evaporation of legal prestige. Furthermore, the relentless wave of frivolous lawsuits against media outlets and political opponents nearly all of which were dismissed by the courts in the last 30 days, has sent a chilling message to the international community. The fact that the president's own lawyers are being sanctioned millions of dollars for filing bad faith litigation proves that while American institutions are resisting, the cost of that resistance is chaos. America is no longer a predictable partner. It has become a systemic risk that other nations must now learn to hedge against. In the eyes of the world, the retribution campaign hasn't just failed to punish enemies. It has succeeded in making America an international pariah. As we reach the conclusion of this retrospective on the nightmare year of 2025, the final verdict is not one delivered by a single judge or a jury in a Washington courtroom. It is a verdict delivered by the collective action of the global community. The global revolt we have witnessed, the sanctions, the intelligence cutoffs, the financial decoupling, and the hollowing of NATO, represents the definitive end of the era of American exceptionalism. We are no longer living in a world where the United States is the undisputed anchor of the democratic order. We are living in the first year of a post-American world, where our closest allies have decided that their survival depends on their ability to protect themselves from the United States, rather than with it. The hidden cost of this institutional meltdown will be paid by the American public for decades. When trust is liquidated, it cannot be printed back into existence like currency. Every American who finds their dollar buys less, every worker whose job is lost to retaliatory tariffs, and every citizen who feels less safe because our allies are no longer sharing critical intelligence is feeling the tangible reality of this fracture. The transition from America first to America alone was not a strategic masterstroke, it was a systemic collapse. By prioritizing personal retribution and executive overreach over the sanctity of alliances, the presidency has effectively traded 75 years of global leadership for a few months of perceived domestic impunity. The rise of this new order is characterized by regional self-reliance. From the European strategic autonomy to the new Pacific trade blocs that pointedly exclude Washington, the world has moved on. They have learned that the American constitutional guardrails are more fragile than they appear. They have seen that a single administration can turn a superpower into a systemic risk. As we look ahead, the challenge for the United States will not be winning back its status through force, but through a long, painful process of proving it can once again be a nation of laws rather than a nation of men. The nightmare of 2025 was a wake-up call that many in Washington chose to ignore, but the rest of the world has already acted upon. The fracture is permanent and the revolt is complete.